making adjustment curves. After you found the base exposure time for the stochastic screen, the aquatint screen, as well as the image exposure time, you'll need to construct an adjustment curve. The adjustment curve is applied to your image before printing. It compensates for the discrepancies between the digital and analog processes used to create a useful printing plate. Here you see this image, this file that I have labeled 8x10 gray gamma 2.2. That is the digital curve, the digital image, and that was what we used to make the transparency, which was then exposed to the polymer plate to make the plate. Now we used that subsequent plate and exposed it and made this print. So we're going to call this the analog because it's an analog print. Okay, so what we want to do is we're focusing on adjusting this analog print here. Okay, and we're going to find which time worked the best. And I know it was this one. It was the square or the rectangle that had a 5-minute aquatint exposure and a 5-minute image exposure. So I'm gonna, let's see, I'm gonna use the move tool. Actually, let's use the zoom tool and we'll zoom in on this. Probably back up a little bit until I have just that rectangle mostly isolated. So I have all of this about as big as I can get it on my screen. Okay, and let's find the equivalent over here digitally on this digital image. Okay, so I have the similarly sized rectangle. What I want to do is copy this rectangle. So I'm going to use the rectangular marquee tool and surround this rectangle. Actually, I don't need both sides. I only need one piece of it. So with that selected, I'm going to hit Control C or Command C if you're in a Mac. So I have that copied. I'm going to go back to the analog version and hit Control or Command V. And I'm going to move this over next to the analog layer. Now it's a slightly different size, so I'm going to have to scale it down. Go to Edit, Transform, Scale. I'm not going to worry about the aspect ratio. What I'm trying to do is get the ends lined up and also get the edges of each rectangle lined up. Like so 70 matches 70, 60, 60, 50, 50, etc. Because that's really what I'm going to be comparing. Okay, that looks pretty good. So yes, I want to apply the transformation. All right, now look over here. This top layer, that's the digital image. So let's double click and label that digital. And let's go to the background. I'm going to change the name of the background. Okay. Analog print. Now, what I want to do is we're going to use a compensation curve, or we're building a compensation curve. So let's go over here to the adjustments palette and pick the curves. Okay, now if I did work on this curve, it's going to change both the digital and analog print because the way layers work is they change everything below the layers in the stack. So if I move this curve down here, it's going to affect everything below it. So it's only going to affect the analog print. It's not going to affect the digital layer. And that's the way we want it because we want to leave the digital layer alone because that's our reference point. This digital layer, we don't want to change that. That's our goal, is to get the analog side to look like the digital side. So the curves goes above the analog layer but below the digital layer. Okay. Now, how do curves work? This looks like, well, it is a straight line, but this graph here is Actually, you see down here, it has input and output. Let me click here right on 50/50. Okay, input. What this is essentially at 50%, the computer is saying, I want 50% density, right? And so it's calling for it. That's the input. I want this 50% density. And in order to get 50%, it's saying, well, you only need 50%. Well, the reality is, look over here. 50% density is what we call for. That's the input. Our resulting output after all the steps we do is a little lower. All right, what you want to do once you've labeled the layers, your analog print, here I'll click this on, off and on. So analog's the actual physical print, the gravure print, and the digital, which is the theoretical. We're trying to match the analog to the digital. Okay. These are kind of hard to read with the grain that they have. If they're zoomed way out, we can read it because they blur a little bit, but at the zoom level we're at, they're a little hard to read. See how these over here are smooth. So what we need to do is smooth these out. And the way to do that is go to Filter, Blur, and Average. Okay, if I did it without selecting anything, the whole darn thing's going to be averaged, right? So we don't want to do that. So I'll hit Control or Command Z to get back out of that. I want to do that to very specific regions. So I'm going to use this rectangular marquee tool and select as much of the 0% as I can without overlapping into the next rectangle, and also without grabbing any of the black marks, just the area that's supposed to be tone. So select that, then I go to Filter, Blur, Average. See how that smooths it out? And do the same thing for the 10%. Filter, Blur, Average. And what I can do, since the last filter function I did was average, when this is what I want to do again, I can hit Control or Command F. And that does the same thing. So Control or Command F. Now Control or Command F only works because that's the last filter function that I did. If I had selected a different filter function, Control or Command F would do that function. So I'm going to do this to each one. I'm selecting the area, as much area as I can, and I'm going to Filter, Blur, Average. And that makes this grayscale much easier to read and much easier to compare. And see, 70% and 70% are pretty close. And 60 and 60, this one's a little too light and this is lighter. So this is about where the crossover is. You'll see that a lot. You might not see a perfect crossover at a, at a 70 or 60 or 50. It'll probably be, in reality, a 68 or something like that. But at some point, there's going to be a crossover. At some point, things are going to match. So we kind of want to remember that. And this is going to change a little bit, because what we have to do is set this up as here, the digital side, this 0% density is theoretical. There's no ink there. And 100% density is theoretical. It's as dense in ink that we can lay down. Okay, so this side's really theoretical. This is what we actually get. This 0% has a little bit of tone to it because the paper is not super bright white that we're using. And this 100% is not as dense as the theoretical, because the ink we're using is not as dense as this theoretical version on the computer. So we need to adjust for that a little bit so that our scale is a little more realistic. Okay, this is really 0% and this is 100%. And the way to do that so we can compare is select a levels adjustment layer or make a levels adjustment layer. Now the levels adjustment layer needs to be below the digital layer so it does not affect the digital layer, but above the analog layer so it affects the analog. Now look down here. See this histogram? We can see there's a lot of head and toe. There's a lot of room here. Actually, there's not much over here. But move this slider over until it just barely touches the histogram. And see how 100% now starts to match 100% down here. I'm going to open it up a little more until it just barely starts to be 100%. And same with up here. This is the white side, the 0% side. I'm going to move that until it's pure white. Now that's great, but I lose 10%. I don't want to lose that. I come back a little bit. I'm sort of splitting the difference between being right here on the edge of the histogram and opening it up all the way. If I open it up all the way, I lose down through 20%. This is one of those things where you just can't compensate for experience. What I'm doing is that's not totally white, but that's okay. We're gonna pretend that that's white. And if things have to get a little darker, open that up just a little more. Okay, so see, 10% needs a lot of help, and 90% needs a lot of help, and that's often the case. And see, our 70% crossover, that changed. And if we saw this in real life, that would be different anyway, where 50% is a little light, 60% is a little dark. So somewhere between 50 and 60% is where the curve is going to cross over. So let's do this. Let's Control-click analog print and levels. See how they're both highlighted blue? Here, let's stop. If they were not, let's undo it. If they were not highlighted blue, what we can do is select levels and then Control or Command click analog. So these two are selected and I want to merge those two layers. Okay. Now we're going to set up our compensation curve. So go up here and select curves, make a new curves layer. And again, this curves layer needs to be below the digital layer so it doesn't affect it, but above the, oh, that says levels now, above the analog layer. Renamed it because I merged it. Okay, so click on curves so it's active. And look how I'm mousing over this. Do you see the input and output? What I'm going to do is I'm going to start here at 50%. I want input 50%, output 50%. And I kind of missed a little bit, so I'm just going to make that 50 and make that 50. Now I've got a point plotted right at 50 and 50. I do the same thing for 60 and 60. 70 and 70, 80 and 80, 90 and 90. That said 91 and 92, so but I want to make them 90 and 90. And do the same thing for 40 and 40. I'm just setting up the plot points. And if I click off here in the neutral area, that deactivates the plot point. So when I mouse over, it's going to tell me where I'm at. Close enough. We make it 20 and 20. 10 and 10. And in this process, it gets really, really, really finicky down at the ends. So I like to plot 5 and 5 and 95 and 95. Okay, so that's ready to make adjustments. And if we click on 50 and 50, okay, now see how it's black? That means it's selected. If I use the arrow keys and press up or down, I'm changing what that does. And look over there and see how that changes the analog side, the left side. It's making it darker and is making it lighter. And what I can do, instead of having to click on the next point, I can just hit the plus button or the minus button and shuttle between the points and start making adjustments. Okay, and the idea is to just adjust the curve so that this side starts to match this side. All right, let me pause for a minute and tell you how I got to this system with making adjustment curves visually like this. It's because no matter whose technique I used, and they're all really based on the same principle, I ended up having to adjust the first curve that I made because it was too flat for the process. So I ended up doing these manual adjustments. So I'm going to show you how to do this completely manually. And again, what we're doing is we're trying to make this left side, this analog side, look like this digital side. And actually, here, let's start at 40%. Okay, so let's go up to, we'll go to 40%. Okay, so I've got 40% selected, and I need to make it darker. So I hit the up arrow key until it gets darker. And when you see it start to reverse like this, you want to go to the next plot point down. You want to kind of bring this whole curve up, not just a single point. So I'm going to hit the minus key to move over to 50% and bring that up and darken that a little bit. And actually, if you look on the left, it starts to get 50%, starts to look closer and closer. The analog starts to look closer to the digital. I'm going to hit the minus key, move over to 60, and darken that as well. And you can see that's almost too dark. Right there is pretty good. Okay, hit the plus key, and I'm going to go down to 30%. And 30% definitely needs to get darker. It's the lower densities that need to get darker, huh? I go down to 20%, bring that up, make it darker. You kind of have to treat all these as, well, they are a group. So you have to treat them in succession. You can't really just strictly do one at a time. What am I working on? 40%? Yeah, 40% could be darker. 50 is looking yeah, 50 is looking okay. And see how moving one point changes everything else? I'm down working on 70%. There, it's never going to be perfect first time out, but we're getting pretty close. What you can do, let me show you what these two tools do. Okay, this is a pencil tool. So see these kind of bumps? I can kind of cut off, I redraw the curve. And then hit this button. That's going to smooth it out. and hit Command Z or Control Z to go back, and then go back up to this. So I'm dealing with the points. Now I've got this I have very few points plotted, but that's because it's a really smooth curve. Okay, and it looks pretty good over here. This is still a little dark, but that's okay to have a little bit of tone here. And 100% is 100%. That's easy. 90 is that's looking okay. 80% looks a little dark. 70% looks good. 60% looks a little light. I'm going to save this curve anyway. Okay. So let's see. Curve example 01. And see how now it's here. I have some others that I made recently that are in the drop-down menu. But we're looking at curve example 01. Okay. And what's best to do at this point is, well, yeah, save the curve. And where do we have the most problems? Well, again, down here, 90% and denser, and 10% and lighter. So let's see if we can find. We have 10%? Okay, let's see if we can make that a little darker without affecting too much of the rest of it. All right. Now see how the curve got flat here? Got just perfectly horizontal, right? Now look what happened. 50 and 40% look the same now. Okay, because that means that if I'm calling for 40%, I output whatever this is. This is the 10, 20, 30, 40. Let's see what it is. So it's another 10 value. But if I'm calling for 50%, I'm asking for the same value, so they match. That's not right. So I'm going to hit plus to go back down to the 10% value and drop that. So ultimately, like I said, it's never going to be perfect, but you want to make sure a bunch of these match and you have a smoother tonal range throughout here. Make different additional plots and kind of noodle with it a little bit. We're going to open up the low end and try and darken the top end a little bit. And what you can do to prevent this over flattening is you make a lot of plot points. And that way, when I move this one a lot, it's not going to affect the curve as bad, the rest of the curve as bad. Okay, now it's worth saving that one too. Save curve preset as okay, so that's the first one, that's the second one, here's the first one. Not a lot of difference. Actually, there is a lot of difference. Okay, see how example 2 is pretty flat? And this one has high contrast, is kind of flat in the middle. So it's worth printing both of these and seeing what we get.